Hello, and thank you for watching this short video on the SBTi Net-Zero Criteria public consultation. This video is part of a series of other videos that have been released in the past couple of days discussing specific topics on the public consultation. And then in this video, I'll be discussing Scope 3 emissions abatement targets in the context of the net zero criteria. I'll briefly talk through the background on Scope 3 emissions abatement targets, as well as the questions that we've included in the public consultation. Also, just to note that this is work in progress, and thus the information presented here may still change as the project progresses. So emissions abatement is at the heart of achieving net zero, and net zero targets must include clearly defined emissions abatement and neutralization goals, as you can see in the diagram on the left-hand side, which also enhance the transparency and the credibility of the company's overarching net zero targets. So for this session, I will focus specifically on Chapter 3, discussing net zero target ambition, Chapter 4, discussing a net zero target boundary, and also Chapter 6, which will be discussing interim science-based targets. And all of this is in the context of Scope 3 emissions abatement targets. When we speak of Scope 3 ambition, this indicates the minimum amounts that companies must reduce their emissions to reach a state of net zero consistent with the ambition of the Paris Agreement. As such, with net zero criteria requires Scope 3 emissions in the emissions abatement boundary of net zero targets to be reduced by an amount that is consistent with reaching a goal or a global net zero goal in alignment with 1.5 degrees Celsius. So this topic is more extensively covered in the emissions abatement and residual emissions video. I would therefore encourage you to have a look at that video specifically. And then when we refer to the Scope 3 target boundary, this specifies the required emissions abatement boundary coverage of net zero targets. The target boundary determines whether a company is committed to addressing the most material sources of emissions in their value chain. And specifically for Scope 3, the abatement boundary of Scope 3 net zero targets needs to be comprehensive and also actionable for companies in a societal shift to global net zero. The SBTi criteria requires most companies to cover at least 67% of their emissions in Scope 3, as well as meeting other sector-specific boundary coverage requirements. So moving on to the Criterion 17, which is around the requirement to have a Scope 3 target. So this criterion requires all companies to include Scope 3 emissions in their emissions abatement boundary of net zero targets. And the importance of including value chain emissions is described in our Foundations for Net Zero Target Setting paper that we released in the past year. And also it's consistent with the mitigation hierarchy that's been shared by Ekstrom et al. 2015, whereby companies are required to reduce their emissions before engaging in neutralization activities. Moving along to Criterion 18. which speaks of emissions abatement target boundary, specifically the emissions abatement boundary of net zero targets. So 3 different options have been presented here around the boundary. There's version A, version B, and version C. For version A, there's a requirement to cover at least 95% of total scope 3 emissions. This version is more comprehensive of a company's value chain emissions, but its lack of flexibility may be incompatible with the existing or the known challenges that we have around scope 3 accounting. As an example, the calculation of scope 3 categories may be, error prone, and the ability of a company to even collect and influence scope 3 emissions is in some cases quite limited. By contrast, version B may focus emissions reduction efforts more effectively. But on the other hand, a benefit of version A is that sequential targets that would not require significant boundary changes over time due to changing scope 3 proportions. And this is detailed more in chapter 6, which speaks of the interim science-based targets still in this draft net zero criteria. And then for version B, this option is requirements to cover at least 67% of scope 3 emissions with additional sector-specific requirements for activities that must be included in the target boundary. So under this version, companies must cover at least 67%, as I mentioned earlier on, of the scope 3 emissions, and also meet other sector or activity specific requirements. So as an example, for perhaps the food, a food or agricultural company could be required to include their upstream deforestation related emissions in the emissions abatement boundary of the targets. And in this example, if the 67% threshold were not met after the inclusion of deforestation related emissions, the company would need to add additional scope 3 sources to surpass that 67% threshold. And also to mention that the SBTi already has several sector-specific scope 3 criteria that are currently active. So, for example, the vehicle as an example for vehicle manufacturers, they must include all well-to-wheel emissions in a combined scope 3 target boundary, and this includes emissions from the upstream production of fuels, and also emissions from the combustion of fuels during the use of the vehicle. Version B in comparison to version A and C is more consistent with SBTi's current scope 3 criteria. Version C is then detailing out the requirement to cover at least 95% of total emissions in scope 1, 2, and 3, slightly different from version A. And so for this version it really aims to ensure a comprehensive coverage of emissions in all scopes, so in scopes 1, 2, and 3, while providing a bit more flexibility compared to version A that we spoke about earlier, and for companies with a relatively low share of total emissions in scope 3. And I'll talk you through just in a couple of seconds. I'll talk you through an example further demonstrating this. So with version C, it does not allow companies to bypass Criterion C5 of the net zero criteria. So at least 95% of the emissions in scope 1 and 2 still need to be included in the emissions abatement boundary. And unlike version A and version B, version C provides or groups together emissions in scopes 1, 2, and 3 to determine the minimum scope 3 boundary coverage. But also to note that, grouping emissions in scope 1, 2, and 3 is sometimes considered inappropriate because the accounting methods differ widely for these scopes. And in terms of uncertainty and the margin of error, as well as in terms of control and influence. So let's look at a practical example of version A, B, and C for Criterion 18 to determine the minimum scope 3 emissions abatement boundary coverage. In this example, we've got version A, B, and C, which are being compared, and we're comparing these by assessing 4 example companies with different emissions profiles, as can be seen in the second and third columns of the table presented, and 2 target setting scenarios, which we've named scenario 1, which is in blue, and scenario 2, which is in green. So for companies I to IV, they vary from having high relative proportion of emissions in scope 3. You'll see a company I, for example, has 80%, whereas company IV has a proportion of 10% of scope 3 emissions. And also to take note of, in scenario 1, companies exclude 5% of their scope 1 and 2 emissions for the target boundary, so that's 95% coverage. While in scenario 2, companies are excluding 0% of their scope 1 and 2 emissions. So this is then 100% coverage. So getting into the different scenarios, so version C is identical to version A, as you'll see with the red highlights there. Assuming, a 67% of scope 3 emissions are included under version B, it results in the lowest emissions coverage. And then for scenario 2, version C offers a bit more flexibility, as we mentioned earlier on, with a lower proportion of emissions in scope 3. So this is specifically an example that can be seen for companies III and company IV in terms of the scope 3 emissions that they need to cover. And you'll see that with the red block that's been highlighted now. These companies would have the option of, covering emissions in scope 3 by covering a greater proportion, so more than 95% of emissions in scope 1 and 2. In terms of the total coverage of scope 1 and 2 for this, or scope 1, 2, and 3 for this example, emissions is the emissions coverage is highest under version A, which you'll see now in the red highlighted block, and followed closely rather by version C, as you'll see again in the red highlighted block there. Version B also yields a high coverage, but this is only for companies III and IV, and also, as you can see in this red highlight. Also important to note that under version C, the percentage of scope 3 emissions that end up being included is sensitive to the percentage of scope 1 and 2 emissions that have been included. So in other words, it offers, some flexibility around the relative coverage of scope 1 and 2 versus scope 3 emissions that companies include in their target boundary, while obviously still ensuring, as mentioned earlier on, that the 95% coverage of total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions is maintained. Which then brings us to the first consultation question related to scope 3 targets, and this is question 5. Specific to Criterion 18. So we understand that companies will need to include their scope 3 emissions in the emissions abatement boundary of net zero targets. In the previous slides, I've spoken about, or I've spoken through the 3 approaches that a company can use to determine the minimum scope 3 boundary coverage. So our question is, do you have a preference for version A, B, or C? And if you would just explain the preference that you have. So in the next couple of slides, I will then discuss chapter 6, which is going into detail on interim science-based targets. So for a bit of context, in the previous slides, we've spoken about how a global level emissions need to be reduced by about half in the next 10 years to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius and meet the goals that have been prescribed in the Paris Agreement. So the next steps that businesses should be taking to abate their emissions during the transition to net zero will be crucial, and therefore highlighting the importance of SBTs, and these being an important prerequisite for companies wishing to set net zero targets. In the current SBTi criteria, we resolve most of what is required from companies to abate their emissions during the transition to net zero. However, there are several questions that have emerged that need to be addressed specifically from a net zero perspective. And these questions relate to the scope 3 minimum ambition, and also the boundary of SBTs. And it's important to note that also the outcomes of this section specifically of the criteria are planned to be integrated into the general SBTi criteria for all SBTs from 2022 going forward. So maybe perhaps taking a step back and looking at what we have in the current SBTi criteria and what we're currently proposing in the net zero criteria. In the current SBTi criteria, emissions reduction targets covering the entire value chain or individual scope 3 categories are considered ambitious if they fulfill any of the 3 following requirements. So firstly, if it's an absolute emissions reduction target, secondly, if it's an economic intensity target, and thirdly, if it's a physical intensity target. So with an absolute emission reduction targets, these need to be consistent with the level of decarbonization required to keep global temperature increase to 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial temperatures. And absolute targets for this instance can be expressed in intensity terms based on the units that are consistent and representative of the company's activities. And then secondly, we mentioned the economic intensity targets. So that results in, or economic intensity targets need to result in at least a 7% year-on-year reduction of emissions per value per unit of value added rather. And then lastly, physical intensity reduction targets need to be aligned with, the relevant sector reduction pathway within the SDA, or targets that do not result in absolute emission reductions and lead to linear annual intensity improvements equivalent to about 2% at a minimum. However, since the IPCC's publication of the special report on global warming of 1.5 degrees, in particular, scientists and civil society have united around the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. But it's not clear whether SBTi should require a minimum ambition of 1.5 degrees or well below 2C, specifically for scope 3 targets or interim scope 3 targets. And in addition to this, considering, the trade-off between high ambition and high barriers to entry for voluntary initiative like the SBTi, we do recognize that the translation of global and sector-specific pathways to corporate target setting is an approximate task. And so, temperature classifications are meaningful, but it should be handled with a bit of nuance. And then, we've spoken currently that the SBTi requires companies to set scope 3 targets if scope 3 emissions are at least 40% of total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And companies, and with this, companies are then required to cover at least 67% of their emissions in their SBTs. This criteria is quite important. And, this criteria of 40% and a 67% coverage is meant to focus companies on the emissions categories that are most relevant and material to their climate impact, as well as, recognize that the challenges, that there are challenges that are inherent in scope 3 emissions accounting and intervention. However, there are potential benefits to requiring all companies to set scope 3 targets and increasing, the minimum scope 3 boundary coverage of SBTs. And as an example, these changes could lead to a more comprehensive and consistent approach with net zero target setting and a more consistent and ambitious approach across companies. So in the next couple of slides, what I'll cover is firstly, considering whether or not to include a criteria to raise the minimum ambition of scope 3 targets compared to the full range that is currently validated by the SBTi. And then secondly is whether to introduce a more stringent scope 3 target boundary coverage for SBTs compared to the current minimum. So let's take a look at Criterion 31, which is detailing out the requirements to have a scope 3 target. So in the net zero criteria, we require that all companies set a scope 3 emissions or shall include scope 3 emissions in the boundary of their SBTs. And just firstly to mention that, you know, this criterion requires all companies to include scope 3 emissions in the boundary of the interim targets. And it's obviously more stringent than what we currently have in the SBTi criteria, which requires companies to include scope 3 in the boundary of SBTs if scope 3 emissions are more than 40% of their total scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And secondly, because all companies are required to cover scope 3 in net zero targets, which is further detailed out in Criterion 17, this criterion limits the amounts that a company's net zero target boundary may differ from its interim SBT, which is obviously beneficial from a consistency and a planning perspective. So then the consultation that we have for Criterion 31 is based on specifically this point on interim SBTs and whether interim SBTs are required to set are required to cover scope 3 emissions. And we basically asking you whether or not you agree with this criterion. So moving on to Criterion 32, which is around the scope 3 boundary. So this is similar to Criterion 18 that we spoke about a bit earlier, presenting 3 different versions of a possible boundary. We spoke about version A requiring at least 95% of total scope 3 emissions, version B requiring 67% of total scope 3 emissions with additional sector specific requirements, and version C or version C, which requires 95% of total emissions for scope 1, 2, and 3. In the previous slide, we went through a practical example comparing version A, B, and C for 4 different companies. I would encourage you again to have a look at that question or at that example again to further understand the strengths and the weaknesses for each of the options that have been presented. Moving on specifically to the consultation for C or Criterion 32, which is question 20 in the public consultation questions. We've detailed our 3 approaches to determining the minimum scope 3 boundary coverage in Criterion 32, and we really have 2 questions here. Firstly, do you have a preference for version A, B, or C? If so, if you would please explain that preference. And then secondly, we're asking you whether you think that the minimum scope 3 boundary of interim SBTs that we've spoken about in C32 should be identical to the minimum emissions abatement boundary of net zero targets, which we spoke about in Criterion 18. Also to note that if the minimum scope 3 boundary of interim SBTs is not identical to the emissions abatement boundary of net zero targets, which we discussed in the previous chapter, then companies may be required to revise their Scope 3 target boundary in a future year through the target recalculation process to cover parts of the company's value chain that were not covered by the interim SBT. So just to bear that in mind when responding to this question. And then moving along to Criterion 33, which speaks of the level of ambition for science-based Scope 3 reduction targets. Here we've got two different versions that we are presenting for the public consultation, version A and version B. For version A, emissions must be covered by targets consistent with delivering a 1.5 aligned emissions outcome. Version A does incentivize greater near-term ambition by potentially inhibiting the adoption of the kind of standard among companies, given the challenging nature of Scope 3 emissions management. And the minimum Scope 3 ambition of this version far exceeds what we currently have in the SBTi criteria, specifically Criterion 20 of our existing SBTi criteria, which, it ranges, or in the current criteria, we have a range between, absolute increase in Scope 3 emissions to align with 2 degrees, which is which is about 1.23 linear annual reduction in absolute emissions. And then for version B, emissions must be covered by targets consistent with delivering a well below 2-degree aligned emissions outcome. So compared to version A, this version would pose less of a barrier to entry for companies. However, the minimum ambition of interim SBTs would be less aligned with the goal of limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. Because it's often, harder for companies to control, influence, or even assess changes to their Scope 3 emissions, some experts some experts in the corporate and sustainability community contend that Scope 3 emissions should not be held to the same minimum ambition as seen for Scope 1 and 2. It's also important to note, looking at these two versions, that the wording of this criterion differs from Criterion 30 of the draft Net-Zero Standard. The wording for this criterion is meant to suggest that some targets can be deemed consistent with developing a 1.5 or a well below 2-degree aligned outcome without strictly relying on an emissions accounting based methodology. So as an example, research suggests that supplier and engagement targets are an effective Scope 3 approach if meeting stringent criteria. So other target setting approaches could be considered for Scope 3 that meet this criteria. Also to take note of is that to meet this criteria or criterion, emissions accounting based methods like the absolute contraction or SDA must be aligned to 1.5 degrees or well below 2C, as we've specified in the draft criteria, which does increase from the SBTi's current minimum ambition for Scope 3. So looking at the consultation question related to C33 specifically, we are asking you based on, criteria, Criterion C33, the minimum ambition for scope 3 of interim SBTs will either be well below 2C or 1.5C aligned. And these are both quite an increase from the current range of options available for companies for scope 3 target setting. So we are asking you whether you think the minimum ambition should be A, 1.5 degree aligned, or B, well below 2C aligned. And we've discussed in the previous slides the pros and cons for each approach. And that is the last question of the public consultation, specifically in relation to scope 3 emissions. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to your contribution during this public consultation process. Please also do listen in on the other videos that have been prepared, which are shedding a bit more light on the other topics that have been covered in the net zero draft criteria. Thank you.